Hi, welcome to this, is it the sixth clip we've got to now for this week's lecture on materialism and practice in anthropology. This is the usual final clip usually, where I present some of the criticisms to the approaches that we've been looking at each week. I'm actually going to have an extra little clip sneakily, as I said, so this isn't the last one, but I'm going to make it brief. So I'm keeping the critiques to Marxist approaches in anthropology specifically. So not everything that I have to say will apply, for example, to Bourdieu. But nevertheless, the overall kind of approach of a Marxist anthropology is what I'm interested in here when I'm kind of outlining some criticisms. So as we saw, Marxism is rooted in a concern with capitalism. So for anthropologists, it's always been a problem how to extend the kind of Marxist approach to social, political, economic, cultural phenomena to societies that are not as centrally involved with capitalism as the societies that Marx himself was writing about, such as Britain, for example, right? Is a Marxist framework able to account for non-capitalist societies, right? Now, as we saw, some have argued, very persuasively actually in many ways, that there are no societies today that are somehow immune to the global system of capitalism, neoliberalism, and so on, right? But even so, if that's the case, does that therefore mean that Marxism is the best prism through which to see everything, right? Does the fact that all societies in some way or other are affected by the kinds of processes that Marx was interested in mean that Marxism therefore becomes the best approach to understanding what makes those societies tick, what makes their cultural formations be what they are, and so on? So I guess that's the kind of overall question. And really this question comes to life when you start looking at certain attempts, very influential within anthropology, that have been made to discuss the kinds of phenomena that anthropologists have always been interested in discussing, such as, for example, local ritual practices or cosmological beliefs and so on in particular parts of the world, when anthropologists have attempted to address these questions through kind of Marxist frameworks. And we saw an example of that with Maurice Bloch's account of a circumcision ritual in Madagascar, seen as a kind of form of reproduction of ideology, right? So to give you another example, Michael Taussig, or Mick Taussig, Australian anthropologist, really fantastically interesting figure in anthropology, made a really interesting argument about Andean mining practices, so mining in the Andes, and particularly the adoration of this very ambiguous devil-like figure called El Tío, who I've actually met in my own trip with a colleague from UCL called Nico Tassi, when he took me to Bolivia and showed me some of these practices, which are really absolutely mind-blowingly fascinating. But this is a kind of ritual adoration or relationship that miners establish with this devil-like figure called the El Tío, their uncle, who is deemed to have the desire for periodic human sacrifices, and the accidents that happen during mining are conceptualized by Bolivian, Peruvian, and other Andean miners as having been sacrificial demands that this divinity of the deep mining earth is making of them, right? Now, Mick Taussig in his book says that this is effectively a local conceptualization of the evils of capitalism, right? It's the Tío cult comes to represent, it's a local way of representing the problems inherent with the exploitative relationships that mining, seen in the global kind of framework of capitalist exploitation and resource extraction, involves for these local miners who are very often extremely poor and destitute, right? And it's an extremely interesting argument and goes into great detail, for example, into Marx's account of commodity fetishism. the idea that inanimate objects come to be imbued with animate powers and forces, are fetishized in that sense, which Marx interprets as a kind of function of the labor theory of value that I mentioned in an earlier clip, and the alienation that exploitative forms of labor lead to. I can't go into the details of Marx's theory of commodity fetishism, but I'm just pointing out here that Mick Taussig uses that theorization to great effect when he talks about the ways in which the valuable ores that mining is designed to extract from the earth are animated through this devil-like figure of El Dio. So this is an indigenous form of commodity fetishism, he argues, right? But what's interesting here from a critical point of view is to think to what degree it would be persuasive to read on to these Andean practices a kind of desire on the part of these miners to advance a kind of symbolized almost critique of global capitalism, which is effectively what Mick Taussig is saying. He's saying that the teocult is an indigenous form of criticism of capitalism. And the question is there ethnographic evidence to show that actually the miners that he's talking about were actually interested in advancing that kind of critique through their ritual practices of adoration and sacrifice in relation to El Dio? Or is this an interpretation that is read on to the material by an Australian, in this case, anthropologist who's analyzing it from the outside, right? So this tendency to wonder whether Marxist analyses are effectively taking the framework developed in 19th century Germany and England with Karl Marx and read it on to all these different societies that they encounter is really the problem that we're looking at here. And I guess the broader problem really is one of the fear of reductivism once again, right? So this fundamental premise of Marxist anthropology is to say that material stuff is more real than the rest of the stuff, that ultimately what goes on in human lives comes down to the material conditions of existence, the modes and means of production and so on. And that things like ritual or kinship or cosmology or mythology, etc., can all be ultimately explained with reference to this fundamental level of reality. That can end up being reductionist and ends up explaining away, if you like, some of these really fascinating and complex aspects of human lives that we find in different parts of the world or in our own society, always kind of reducing them to a lower level. And the danger, of course, ultimately is that these forms of reduction are also ethnocentric. We're exporting distinctions that were arrived at in European political and economic theory and political philosophy with Karl Marx, Friedrich Engels, and so on. And we take that as a framework that we then export onto the different phenomena that we're studying and kind of refract them through decisions that we already have made in our own mind about how the world is, what makes it operate, and so on. And in a sense, you could say that in a conceptual level is a kind of colonial move. You're kind of exporting your own assumptions and inflicting them onto the material that you're studying. And that material might be from far away, it might be from where you are, it might be in a different continent, or it might be in a part of society, of your own society that you're seeking to understand. It's still the same activity of exporting your own assumptions and inflecting them and inflicting them on your object of study, which is always the problem of ethnocentrism. So I'll leave it at that. It's a very broad set of criticisms that I'm underlining here. And I'll see you in the next and final clip in which we look at some other forms of engagements with materiality in anthropology that I think is worth you being aware of. See you in the next clip.